Hello, everyone. I'm Natalie, and I did my project on queer representation in media. Let's get into it. First off, a little bit about me. I'm Natalie Klum. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I'm a secondary English education major, and I'm a sophomore. I'm the vice president of the GSA, so obviously I was very interested in this subject. Um, I'm also an RA in Sycamore. Here's a picture of me. And on the left here, we have my dog George, and on the right is Oliver. They're both corgis, and I love them very much. So a little overview of what we're going to go through is first off, we're going to cover a little bit of the history of queer media, just briefly. We're going to then move into why representation matters, and then to finish off, we're going to talk about community shaped by media. Okay, first off, history of queer media. So obviously there was not a lot of representation of queer people for the longest time. The few pieces of representation that did exist were mainly just of gay men and presented as stereotypes just for humor. Bisexual people, trans people, lesbians, no one else was represented than gay men on the few representations there were. Eventually, there was a bit of drawback from religious organizations, and they pushed Hollywood to implement the Hays Code, which was basically a set of rules for what could be shown. It was like a whole bunch of things that included gay people, and yeah. Eventually, those very strict rules, did come back in the 60s, though. And creators were allowed to show much more than they were previously allowed to. Creators had to be creative with how they did show representation, and they started queer coding characters, which is like showing mannerisms and things just implying that characters are gay without actually explicitly saying that they are gay. Overall, queer people were thought of as dangerous after McCarthy's Lavender Scare, which was in line with the Red Scare, and basically McCarthy assumed that all gay people were communists and therefore a threat to national security. The Stonewall riots in 1969 helped the queer community gain a lot more acceptance and rights. They really brought a lot of attention to queer lives and queer rights and why we deserved rights. But eventually in the 80s and 90s, the AIDS epidemic was a tragedy, and it had a seriously negative impact on the queer community. The government more or less ignored the strategy. It wasn't televised, and a lot of misinformation was spread because it wasn't talked about often. It was just branded as a gay disease and only for gay people, even though it did affect every community very significantly, but it mainly ran through the gay male community. Overall, created fear of gay people in general, and a lot of hatred came from that. Over time, representation has become much better and much more frequent in the 21st century, especially with the creation of more social media platforms and stuff like that. Queer characters, although still fall into minor roles and are oftentimes based on stereotypes, they're not the best representations, but they're still more frequent. In 2021, representation is more diverse and common, but is largely only created by a handful of people. So the overall mass majority of media isn't representing gay people. It's just left to a few very passionate people. Okay, on to section 2, why representation matters. On average, consumers spend 7.5 hours per day with media, which honestly, when you take into account of like how much time we're actually awake and not at like work, that is majority of a person's free time. So obviously it's going to have a big influence on their lives. Media is the primary source of information for most of the population, and it also plays a large role in our socialization as children. learning our what's normal for society and what our values are. Our current society has a very heteronormative ideal where straight is considered the default and everyone is considered straight until proven not. A world with this type of norm has a compulsive heterosexual mindset, and that's where everything surrounded in our society is heterosexual. Like, gay people are not thought of as normal and they're like outcast. So obviously this is going to isolate queer people from their peers, which are deemed normal, and they're going to be increased bullying and just thoughts of being outsiders in their entire world. Many families honestly rely on diversity in media to bring up conversations about cultures different than their own, and media overall plays a huge role in creating a more normalized view of the queer community and therefore creating a safer environment for queer people, because if people are knowledgeable on queer people and deem them as normal and a part of society and not as outcasts, they're less likely to be hateful and more likely to accept them as their own. All right, last section here. We have community shaped by media. Queer people have historically found community in each other. They've found each other even when it was difficult all throughout history. Media has been a great way for people to connect over great distances, and social media has done a lot for that, and with providing a sense of community for those who otherwise could not find it in person, for those people who are not safe in their homes to talk about queer identities and those kind of issues. An online space is vital for those people to get an identity of themselves. It can also promote a lot more accurate information and give access to necessary resources like counseling and shelters and that kind of stuff, because queer community is very much subjected to more abuse and homelessness and bullying and those kind of stuff, that resources are very necessary for those kids to be in contact with, and social media can promote those. Film and television can act as a way to bond. We all know, your best friends, you may bond over the new Marvel movie or a new TV show coming out or something like that, and you complain about characters being awful, or you get really excited about characters getting together. That's the same for queer people. Queer characters in TV and movies bring people together in conventions, shipping, fan fiction, all that kind of stuff. They kind of bond people. And because a lot of queer people are isolated in their worlds, their characters in fictional characters are a way for queer people to be validated in their identities and see that their life can be normal, even though they are deemed as abnormal to society. Although negative representation can be quite harmful in many senses, it can create more hate and stigma around different identities.